One of the easiest ways to start playing Magic the Gathering is via the limited format. These are namely Draft, where you draft a deck one card at a time while passing it back around a table, or Sealed, where you open 6 packs all to yourself and build a deck with whatever you open there. These formats are a lot of fun and they're highly accessible to new players because you don't need to own any cards going into them, but there are still some hurdles that new players are going to have to get over because you're going to have to quickly assess cards and build decks on the fly. This can be a daunting task, but it can be made significantly easier if you are equipped with some tools and fundamental truths to help you navigate the deck building process. Now, despite what you may think of me, given my confident demeanor and the fact that I've won a sealed 5K, I'm not actually a limited expert. So to help me talk about all things limited, I have brought in one of the best limited minds in Magic, Ethan Sachs from the Lords of Limited podcast.
Hello. Yes, I am Ethan Sachs. I'm a limited enthusiast, a full-time content creator, co-host of Lords of Limited, which is a weekly podcast dedicated to getting you better at drafting Magic. I've written articles for Channel Fireball and Star City Games. I'm a former Pro Tour and Arena Championship competitor, and I'm really excited to hopefully usher in a new wave of drafters today.
All right, awesome. To start things off, let's talk about how many cards go into these decks. In limited formats, we have a minimum deck size of 40 cards, and in general, we want to stay close to that number. We can go bigger than that, but the reason we want to stay closer to 40 is because the thinner our deck is, the more consistently it's going to play. You're much more likely to draw a card when it is a 1 in 40 chance than when it is a 1 in 46 chance. So Ethan, given this information, how many cards in our deck should be lands and how many should be spells? Are there ever times where we want to run more or fewer lands?
Your baseline for deck building should be 23 spells and 17 lands. Now, you may deviate from that based on a number of different factors. If you have a lot of expensive spells or mana sinks, aka places to put your mana, you may want to end up running more lands, something like 18. Conversely, if your curve is low or you have some spells that produce mana or help you hit your land drops, then you may want to run less lands, like 16. There are even some formats where I've run something super low, like 12 lands in really good cycling decks in Ikoria, but generally 17 lands, 23 spells is a good baseline.
Okay, so when in doubt, I want to be running 17 lands, which means I have 23 spells at my disposal. But when I sit down to build this deck, how do I know which spells to put in those 23 slots? How many should be creatures or pump spells or draw spells? Are there any good fundamentals for what this part of the deck building process should look like?
Creatures are what win games of limited Magic, so you want to make sure you have a high number, something in the high teens. 15 to 17 is a good place to start, which leaves you with about half a dozen other slots to fill in. Removal occupies the next biggest piece of the pie, and you want to make sure you have a variety of removal spells. Something cheap to deal with something small, something that's maybe a bit more expensive, that's your catch-all removal spell, etc. The last few spells may be something in the form of creature augmentation, like a combat trick, or an aura, or a piece of equipment. You might also have a card draw spell, or a creature recursion spell for some powerful bombs out of your graveyard. Decks will definitely deviate from this kind of recipe, but this is a good template to start with.
Okay, so focus on making sure I have a good base of creatures first, and then worry about having answers for what my opponent is doing. And then the rest of the cards in the deck are just whatever I think fits or works in the deck. Sounds simple enough. Let's talk for a bit about the mana value of these cards. In deck building in all forms of Magic, be it limited, standard, commander, anything really, we have something called a mana curve. And a mana curve is just what it looks like if you were to plot all of the mana values for your deck on a graph. Decks that are running a bunch of very cheap 1 or 2 mana spells are going to have a very low mana curve, whereas decks that are running a bunch of spells that cost 5 or more are going to have a much higher mana curve. An easy way to visualize your mana curve in limited environments is to actually physically lay out your cards in columns based on their mana value. This will give you an immediate representation of the density of different mana values in your deck. So Ethan, what kind of mana curve should we be looking to achieve in a limited deck?
So your curve should look just like that. A curve with the majority of the cards in your deck existing in the 1, 2, or 3 mana value slot. This will ensure that you consistently have something to do in the early turns of the game. You run the risk of getting run over by your opponent if your first play isn't until turn 4. Your 2-drop slot is the most important part of your curve. You should have no less than 6 ways to affect the board before turn 3 in your deck, and you'll happily play more. There is no such thing as too many 2-drops. Be particularly choosy about the spells you include in your deck that sit at 4 mana value or higher, since those will only take up about a third of your total spells in your deck. I should specify that where a card sits on your mana curve should be related to where you think you're going to cast it. Obviously, Llanowar Elves is going to sit in the 1-drop slot. I'm hoping to play that on turn 1. Any 2-drop creature, etc. So it's often about things that are affecting the board specifically. Cards like removal spells, like a Doomblade for example, I'm not hoping to fire off my premium removal spell like Doomblade on turn 2, so I wouldn't necessarily put that in my 2-drop slot. Similarly, a card draw spell like Divination, I'm probably not hoping to play that on turn 3. So those you may want to drop off to the side and think about in a different way. The mana curve should be a consideration for things that are actually going to affect the battlefield.
Sure, so I just want to think about like when I am hoping to and wanting to play my spells and position my cards there when I'm laying out my mana curve instead of where they actually might sit based on their mana value.
Exactly. Some players like LSV will actually separate out, when they're building their curves, separate out creatures from non-creature spells to get a better visualization of how many things you have that affect the board versus not.
Hot limited decks have curves. Got it. All of this advice sounds really great, but not all cards serve a singular purpose. In Modern Horizons 3, we had cards that were lands on one side, spells on the other. We have cards like Llanowar Elves in the Foundation set, which is a creature but also produces mana like a land. There are cards in tons of sets that have cycling or land cycling. So how do cards like this affect my deck? Do they count towards my lands? Do they count towards my spells? How does this impact me in the deck building process?
In general, if it costs mana to cast, I don't let that affect the number of lands I'm putting in my deck. If you have too many things that produce lands in addition to your 17 lands in your deck, you can risk flooding, which will ultimately lead to losing the game of Magic, which we don't want. It's a delicate balance, but I'd say for every 3 spells you have that contribute towards your mana production, you could consider cutting a land. So for example, you talked about Llanowar Elves. So if you've got a Llanowar Elves, a land cycler, and something that can go search up a basic land like Spineseeker Centipede from Duskmourn, then maybe you can consider cutting down a land and going to 16. Also, if you have a lot of card draw or card selection, ways to churn through your deck, you might consider cutting a land because you'll be able to dig towards lands when you need them and pitch excess lands when you don't.
Okay, so generally I want to aim towards 17 lands in my deck, but I can adjust that a little bit in either direction depending on what my deck looks like. That makes sense. Okay, so now that I understand how many lands to run in my deck, how do I know how many lands of each color to be including? Can I run 3, 4, or even 5 color decks in limited? What if there's just one card that isn't in the color that I'm playing, but I really want to run it? How do I know how to put these different colors into my deck and how they affect my deck construction?
Most decks will have a 10-7 or 9-8 split of the mana sources for your 2 colors. If you're more heavily slanted in one, like you've got a double-pipped 2-drop and a double-pipped 3-drop in one color, then you'll definitely want to favor 10 sources at least for that primary color in your deck. Otherwise, 9-8 should suffice. And that's still not great. Mana bases in Limited are, by nature, pretty clunky. You will often have hands with 4 red cards and 3 swamps and have to mulligan, and that's just sort of what you're signing up for. So splashing, adding a 3rd color, is going to decrease the consistency of your deck even more. Some formats give you the tools to splash a little more readily. They have an abundance of mana fixing, which are cards that let you either produce mana of many different colors or search up lands from your deck that produce mana of the desired colors. But splashing comes with a cost of consistency, so be sparing with how you do it. A powerful card like Valgavoth's Onslaught from Duskmourn. Should I say what this does? You'll probably just have it on screen, right?
I'll just have it on screen for sure.
Great. A powerful card is certainly worth splashing, but you'll want to have, here's that magic number again, at least 3 sources of that color to splash it. So let's take, for example, Valgavoth's Onslaught, a premium card from Duskmourn, and it's only got a single green pip in its mana cost, so it's definitely splashable outside of a base green deck. In my blue-white deck, I'd have to have at least 3 ways to produce green mana easily. That could come from a basic forest, a Terramorphic Expanse that can go search up that forest, and an ETB tap dual land like Etched Cornfield that taps for one of my base 2 colors and then also helps cast Valgavoth's Onslaught. If I have to run 3 basic forests in my blue-white deck to cast Valgavoth's Onslaught, that's too risky, that's too inconsistent, and I'm better off not splashing it. Beyond that, there are just so many different kinds of scenarios, decks, power level of cards that might make you run a 3rd color, a 4th color, maybe even all 5 colors. But if you're just starting out, and honestly, even if you've been playing Magic for as long as I have, sticking with 2 colors is going to get you more wins.
Okay, so when I'm counting my sources, and I have something like a Terramorphic Expanse, I can count that as any color that the land can go get. How does that count towards, the 3 that I need to splash something?
Yeah, so let's say you've got a blue-white deck and you're splashing the Valgavoth's Onslaught. So you could have 7 plains, 7 islands, 2 forests, and 1 Terramorphic Expanse. And as I'm counting the number of sources that I have in my deck, which I will do before as I'm figuring out my mana base, that Terramorphic Expanse counts in my mind as a forest for my splash, but it also counts as a plains and an island for my 2 base colors. So that brings me up to 8 sources each of my 2 main colors and 3 sources for my splash color.
Do cards like Llanowar Elves that we talked about earlier, or any of the mana rocks that can tap for any color, or even we've seen some creatures in recent set that can filter mana into mana of any color, do those count towards these sources?
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting that you bring up a card like Llanowar Elves, because a lot of the mana fixing that you'll see comes from green cards. So you can count those green cards that produce mana of any color as a source for your splashed card. But then you also have to then sort of tip the scales of your mana base to support green being a consistent color you can find, if green is sort of enabling then the other 4 colors that you're trying to produce.
Sure. So if I have let's say a base green deck and I have a Birds of Paradise in it, I can count that towards any color that I'm trying to splash. But if I have, let's say, a base blue deck and I am trying to splash a green card, it's probably not safe to count the Llanowar Elves as one of my 3 green sources that I need.
For sure, yeah. I want to take a look at that deck and see what happened. But yeah, I think that's a tough ask. Don't splash for fixing is a really good motto to live by in the limited world.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that seems like it would be a clunky and clumsy deck. So not surprised to hear you advising against it. All right, well, thank you very much, Ethan, for coming on today and helping explain all of this limited stuff to us. The limited format is one of the most skill-intensive ways to play Magic. There is so much that you can learn and improve on in your journey as a limited player. So this is a really great foundational bit of knowledge for people to have, but there is certainly a lot more that can be delved into. So if there's anything that you think that we missed or you would like to see covered in a future video, please leave it in the comments below and we'll be sure to tackle that. Ethan, thanks again for being here. Any parting words or thoughts on your way out?
Thank you so much for having me. I truly believe that limited and draft specifically is the best way to play Magic, and I hope folks out there give it a try.
All right, well, great. As we said, if there's anything else you would like to see covered or talked about, drop it down below. If you enjoyed this video and liked hearing about all of the different foundational truths to limited, be sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe. All those things help out a great deal. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye. LOL, lots of love.